A storm stirs the atmosphere, thunder crackling in the distance. As we journey into the shadowed depths of history, where whispers of violence and power echo through the centuries. Here, beneath the false comforts of sanitized historical accounts, lies a truth so dark it has been deliberately erased from the collective memory. This is a story you've never heard before. A story of women condemned to die, stripped of their humanity long before their final moments. Their execution wasn't just the end, it was a spectacle, a public display of power, and for these women, a brutal descent into an abyss from which they would never escape. Imagine the cold, damp stone of a medieval dungeon. The flickering torchlight casts long, dancing shadows as female prisoners sit in isolation, awaiting the inevitable. The walls echo with the sound of metal against stone chains clinking, guards pacing, their eyes void of mercy. For these women, the end is near, but it's not the execution itself that awaits them, it's something far worse. A fate far more sinister and systematic. Before the condemned woman steps onto the scaffold, before the crowd roars for justice, she faces an entirely different form of brutality, one that is concealed from the world, hidden in the darkness of the dungeon, where power thrives unchecked. Here, in the cold silence of the holding cells, her body becomes a battleground. She is stripped of everything, her dignity and spirit crushed before the axe ever touches her neck. This is the untold history. The systematic sexual violence and abuse cloaked under the guise of legal procedure. It was an unspoken rule that condemned women could be humiliated, assaulted, and tortured in ways that left them broken long before they met their fate. In the eyes of the executioners and the guards, these women were no longer human. They were objects to be used, abused, and disposed of, as the sentence of death is handed down. The woman loses all legal standing. In the eyes of the law, she is already dead merely, waiting for her physical form to catch up. It is in this liminal space, where life and death intertwine, that the true horror begins. The guards, the executioner's men who exist on the fringes of society, shunned by the very same system they serve, are empowered by the law's abandonment of the condemned. They are men without conscience, operating outside the realm of normal morality, without fear of reprisal. What happens when men are granted absolute power over women who have no rights, no protections, and no future? The answer is disturbing, and it is this answer that we must now confront. The strip search, a humiliation unveiled in the dimly lit halls of the prison. The condemned woman is led to her fate, but it is not the death sentence she must endure first. It is the strip searcher, so-called routine procedure meant to prevent suicide or concealment of tools. But in practice, this search is a ritual of humiliation, an act of domination disguised as safety. Female prisoners are ordered to disrobe, their bodies exposed to the male gaze of guards and executioners. It is not a quick, clinical search, it is a drawn-out performance, a violation of everything she once was. The men, unfazed by the woman's vulnerability, touch and prod her body with no regard for her dignity, all under the pretense of duty. The woman has no recourse. Resistance is futilely an attempt to defend her body would result in swift, brutal punishment. She is powerless in every sense, her fate sealed. Her body a mere vessel for the twisted whims of those who control her final moments. And when the search is over, she is often left naked, exposed to the harsh cold of the dungeon, while male prisoners are permitted to retain their basic clothing. The nakedness is a special kind of punishment for women, a reminder that their bodies are not their own. But this humiliation is only the beginning. as she languishes in the dungeon, awaiting her execution. She is paraded before others, her suffering an entertainment for those who dare to watch. The guards, often encouraged to bring their colleagues, or even paying customers, turn the dungeon into a perverse theater of cruelty. Her body, once a private sanctum, is now a spectacle, a thing to be gawked at and violated. The night before, a final betrayal, then, as her execution draws near, the night before becomes a final betrayal. The hours stretch on in darkness, filled with the echoes of guards' footsteps, the murmur of malevolent whispers. It is here, in these final hours, that the condemned woman is once again exposed to the deepest horrors. With no future to consider, the guards know this is their last chance to break her, use her in ways that can never be undone. The night becomes a twisted orgy of abuse, a violent climax to an existence that had already been destroyed. In the deep silence of the dungeon, where there is no salvation, no mercy, the woman faces the last, darkest part of her journey. Her suffering is endless, and the men who participate in it, men who should have been held accountable, by law, free to indulge their basest instincts. They know there will be no consequences, for by the time the morning comes, the woman will be gone. She will be dead, and then, in the morning, she will be paraded before the crowd, her body a twisted symbol of justice. The public will see her only as a criminal, her suffering explained away by the supposed crime she committed. But they will never know the truth. They will never know what happened in the dungeon before the scaffold. Conclusion: a truth uncovered. These women condemned to die never stood a chance. Their execution was not just an end, but a twisted ritual of control, humiliation, and sexualized violence, where power over them was absolute. The system that allowed these horrors to unfold was one built on secrecy, on complicity, on the erasure of truth. But now, the truth cannot remain hidden. As we peel back the layers of history, we uncover the brutality that lies beneath the sanitized stories. This is not a tale of justice. It is a tale of power, a tale of abuse that transcends time. The women who were subjected to this brutality may be forgotten by history, but their stories are not. Their suffering, their humanity, deserves to be acknowledged. As the final hours draw near, the condemned woman is stripped not only of her clothes, but of her humanity. Stripped bare before an uncaring world, she faces a darkness that will consume her entirely. The crowds outside the dungeon wait with bated breath, expecting the usual public spectacle. But what they do not know, what they will never understand, is that before she steps into the light of their gaze, she has already been violated in ways that can never be undone. What the public sees, what they are meant to witness, is merely the end of a story and execution. But the truth of what happened before the scaffold is far darker, and it has been hidden from them for centuries. The ritual of power, the use of women's bodies, the medieval execution system was never about justice. It was about power. It was about subjugation, spectacle, and control. The executioner was the hand of the state, carrying out death with cold efficiency. But the real power came from what happened before the axe fell. The act of execution was always a performance. It was a display of state authority, a reminder to the public of the power of the law and its enforcers. But for women condemned to die, it was never just about their crime, it was about their bodies. In a world that viewed women's bodies as vessels to be controlled, their execution was a form of ultimate punishment, a ritualized destruction not only of their lives, but of their dignity. The medieval justice system treated women differently from men, and in the eyes of executioners, guards, and those who watched. They were not just criminals, they were objects to be destroyed. Women accused of crimes like adultery, witchcraft, or even simply being too outspoken, were seen as impure, their very existence threatening the moral fabric of society. And so, their punishment became not just an end to their lives, but an utter erasure of their worth as human beings. The executioners, mercy, a deliberate litho-narrative of the condemned woman's fate, was carefully constructed. The executioners, who had long since detached themselves from any human empathy, offered what they called mercies to the prisoners' force, promises that concealed their cruelty under the guise of kindness. Some executioners offered quick deaths, claiming that their methods would spare the condemned the agony of a long, drawn-out execution. They promised swift beheadings or painless ends, but these promises were nothing more than manipulation. For the executioner, offering a mercy was a way to control the prisoner even in her final moments. It was a liar's cynical trade in which the woman's only choice was to submit, to give in to the whims of those who had already decided her fate. But even this supposed mercy came with its own cruel price. Women were coerced into submission with the promise of a quicker death, only to discover, too late, that the executioner's words meant nothing. The promise of mercy was often broken, and they were instead subjected to the full brutality of public execution, facing the terror and the violence they had been made to fear all along. A final journey, the public spectacle, the journey to the scaffold, was another dark moment in the condemned woman's life. An event meant to strip her of what little was left of her humanity. As she was paraded through the streets, bound, exposed to the jeers of the crowd, she was not just being led to her death, she was being paraded as a spectacle, her suffering a public performance for the morbid enjoyment of the masses. This was the culmination of the executioner's work, a ritual in which power was displayed before the public. The woman's suffering was not meant to remain private. No, it was to be witnessed by all. The crowds, ever hungry for such spectacles, watched eagerly, some throwing insults, others throwing stones, as the condemned woman made her way to her execution. She was an object to be looked at, jeered at, and destroyed before their eyes. They, too, were complicit in her fate, as her suffering became entertainment. But this journey was also an opportunity for the guards and executioners to further humiliate her. The streets were filled with leering faces, and the woman was forced to endure the gaze of strangers, her body bound and exposed. As she was dragged through the streets, the abuse continued. The crowd would taunt her, throw things at her, and those closest to her tormentors would revel in the spectacle. The true face of justice, complicity, and silence, the systems in place that allowed such horrors to unfold, were not accidents. They were part of a larger institutional culture of complicity and silence. The guards, the executioners, the prison chaplains all knew what was happening in the dungeons. They all saw what the condemned women were enduring, and yet they chose to turn a blind eye. Some participated, others remained silent. Few spoke out, and even fewer acted. The chaplains, supposed to provide spiritual comfort to the condemned, often failed to protect these women from the physical and sexual violence they endured. While some tried to intervene, their voices were weak against the far-reaching power of the executioners. In the end, it was not the chaplains who had the power to protect the women, it was the system itself. A system built to protect those who perpetuated these abuses. The executioners were often men who had been cast out from society, deemed too immoral for respectable work. Their status outside the normal moral constraints of society gave them the freedom to engage in acts of cruelty that would have been unthinkable for others. But in their eyes, the condemned women were not human. They were objects. They were tools to demonstrate power, to reinforce control. Their suffering, their abuse, all served a higher purpose in the eyes of those who held the reins of authority, the instruments of pain. Tools of abuse, the tools used during these executions, were not simply meant to kill, they were designed to humiliate, to maim, and to terrify. The breast ripper and the pair of anguish were not instruments of justice. They were instruments of sexual violence, designed specifically to target the most intimate parts of a woman's body. These instruments were meant to send a message, not just to the condemned, but to every woman in society: your body is not your own, and any deviation from societal norms will be met with unspeakable cruelty. The breast ripper, for example, was an instrument of exquisite pain, designed to tear at a woman's flesh with cruel precision. Its purpose was not to kill, but to maim, to destroy the symbol of femininity, of motherhood. It was an instrument that left permanent marks, not just on the body, but on the psyche of the woman who endured its torment. The pair of anguish, a device used for both torture and humiliation, was another tool that targeted the most intimate areas of a woman's body. It was inserted into the vagina or anus and slowly expanded, tearing through flesh and causing unimaginable pain. This device was used to break the woman physically, emotionally, and psychologically before her death. The terror of what awaited her was almost as powerful as the final act of execution itself. The dark legacy, silence, and systematic abuse. A cycle of abuse that women condemned to death endured was not an isolated occurrence. It was part of a larger, systemic pattern of violence that spanned centuries. Every condemned woman who walked to her death had endured unimaginable suffering in the dark corners of the dungeons, and their stories were hidden, buried under layers of historical amnesia. These women were treated as less than human, and their suffering became invisible, erased from the historical narrative to preserve the dignity of the institution. Even when investigations into these practices were launched, when the truth began to emerge, was often too late. The men who perpetuated these abuses were too valuable to be punished. They were necessary for the functioning of the execution system, and so their crimes were overlooked, downplayed, or swept under the rug. The records, when they did exist, were vague and obfuscated, written in a language that shielded the perpetrators from accountability. The women who suffered in silence never received justice. Their pain was dismissed as irrelevant, their voices silenced by the very systems that had destroyed them. Reclaiming the lost voices, but the truth cannot stay buried forever. These women, condemned to die, deserve to be remembered not as criminals, but as victims of a brutal, inhumane system. Their suffering was not the result of their crimes, but of a society that systematically dehumanized them, stripped them of every right, and subjected them to unspeakable cruelty. It is time to rewrite the story, to bring their voices into the light, to acknowledge the horrors that were inflicted upon them in their final days. Their suffering was real, their pain was real, and it should not be forgotten in this story. The true criminals are not the women who were condemned, but the men who used the power of the state to destroy them. The executioners, the guards, the men who watched their silence and complicity, are the true testament to the brutality of the system. And as we remember these women, we must also recognize the patterns of abuse that persist to this day, the systems of power that allow the powerless to be abused. The silencing of victims, the systemic dehumanization of women's these are not relics of the past. They are still with us, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to emerge once again. This is the history that has been buried. This is the truth that must be told.